Good morning. So I've been really challenged lately to pressed in my heart. I see the similarities between but Joseph and Naomi and David in the Old Testament. And it's amazing how these three people keep coming to my mind and showing me so much about their experiences and what they let them teach them and how their lives were forever changed. One thing that just came to me was that they stayed with God. They chose God. Even when things were hard, they pressed through, and they have amazing stories of what happened afterwards. Oh, also Job. And I wasn't thinking Joseph as much as I was Job, because Naomi, Job, and David didn't ask for anything. They didn't go seeking fame. They weren't arrogant and boastful and proud. They just had really difficult situations thrown on them. And those difficult situations became something that people would use as inspiration for years and years to come. So I keep going back and forth with David and King Saul. King Saul, he had everything going for him. And I think the thing that I really grabbed from that is that God gave the people what they thought they wanted. And King Saul started off, he had some pretty good qualities, and he was handsome, and he was tall, and, all those things. He was very charming. But he didn't have enough to hold him when things got tough. And so then some of his not so good character traits came out as it started to get worse and worse. And they seemed so innocent at the time, but these are going to be his downfall. And the sheer fact that he never repented, he never turned back and changed his views, his way. He defended himself and just wanted to keep his status. And if he would have just said, God, please forgive me, change me, and turned his life, everything could have been different. And because God is no respecter of persons, he could have easily have done so many different things. And it's just kind of interesting how what happens to David and what happens to Saul. I just keep going back and forth because there's so much here. And so what I saw today was that David, when he was anointed, he was just a nobody. He wasn't considered even worthy enough in his family to have supper with everyone. They didn't consider him real family. And he had probably been treated this way his whole life. Some people, some of the commentaries were thinking that he was like 20 years old. And I'm wondering if he was conceived out of sin. So I wonder if he was like an illegitimate, or dad had fun one night and oops, now we're pregnant kind of thing. And so maybe he wasn't accepted because he wasn't one of the wives, but maybe a concubine or something like that. It sounds different, so I have to do some more research there. So for all these years, he's never done anything wrong, but his family has always rejected him and just pushed him aside and disregarded him. And yet others can see that he's strong, he's brave, he's courageous, he's incredibly skilled musician. He can play the harp and he can sing like nobody's business. He also is a good person. He doesn't bring attention to himself. He continues to humble himself and loves the Lord. And he doesn't take anything that God gives him and go and brag it off to everybody else like Joseph does. He keeps it quiet and he just keeps doing his business. And I think that's going to be the difference between David and Saul. Because Saul, he got all this stuff that he didn't want. He was just doing his business, and then he became king. And he didn't have to go through those character trials. He didn't have to weed out some of those bad qualities within him. And so he allowed himself just to have the good and didn't refine himself through the process. And I can only imagine how great it must have been to be leader over an entire kingdom and have all the wealth and all the favor and all the people saying, ooh, look at you. And, all of a sudden everybody likes you. And it sounds like it kind of went to his head. From what I understand, he wasn't that way until he was given opportunity. And it's crazy about David. David becomes so important, man after God's own heart. But his own family never thought about him, never considered him. And Samuel had to, come on, isn't there any more kids before he even was brought in from the fields? They didn't tell him to go change and make himself look better. They're like, here he is, whatever. And Samuel's like, oh, this is it. So he privately anoints his head with oil, and then he doesn't say anything. Samuel eats his food, and then he leaves. Samuel doesn't go and declare he's the new king, because he knew that would be the end of everybody, because Saul was power hungry and worried about losing his status and his power. And David, he's just been given a great calling in his life, and he doesn't do anything with it. He doesn't go and start playing trumpets and putting up billboards and announcements and telling people and trying to gather a following. He goes back and just bees with the sheep. He's just taking care of the sheep, and he's just refining his character, probably wondering and waiting what was going to happen next. Can you imagine? You've just been told that God has selected you, the man of God, anoint your head, and you're taking care of sheep. How confusing that must have been for him. Seriously, God, what's going on? You anointed me, and then you left, and now I'm with these sheep again. I thought you were going to do something good in my life, and here I am just doing the same thing I used to do. Where are you? What are you doing? Did I misunderstand you? And so David sounds a lot like similar situations I've had. And I can just picture it because it doesn't say it, but to just go back. And then his family, they're like, yeah, whatever. David, whatever. And when David is anointed, the Spirit of the Lord leaves Saul. For all the years that Saul had been king, God had blessed him with wisdom and discernment and favor, a good attitude, and just made him a pretty happy, whole-rounded person. And God took all that back. And so now he isn't anything but moody and nasty and morose and sad, and he can't get a happy spirit around him because all those things came from God. And since he didn't work for them, he had no idea how to even find them. I think he was a pampered little prince who was lazy and just expected it to come back because he hadn't had to work for it. But David, since he had constantly had to work for the refining and the building of his character, was able to know what to do when things got tough. I think that's what made him so powerful. Another thing about Saul is, the people liked him when he was charming and sweet and made funny jokes. And the Spirit of the Lord left him. I don't think people really wanted to be around him anymore. He wasn't really rational anymore, and he wasn't any fun. And he lost all those things that had made him such a great king. He probably still was handsome, but honestly, in the end, beauty only goes so far if you don't have the character to back it up. Now, David, he was continually carving out a life where his character was being refined and constantly purified through all these really hard struggles. Like first, God gives him a calling, and then he goes right back to work taking care of the sheep. And then when Saul starts having all these big, down, deep, dark spells, they say, okay, well, bring in somebody who's just amazing, just to distract me. So they bring in David. And I believe Saul can feel his presence, feel God's presence on him while he's around David. And I think that's why he liked him so much. David had all of these wonderful gifts and favors of God. And I think he used that to ease himself, because he lost being around God. He didn't seek him out for himself. But every once in a while, it'd be like a person who goes to church every once in a while just to feel better and then they go back to their regular life until things get bad again. And then they go to church and they feel better. And then they go on with their life. I think that's what he was doing there. Is he didn't want God. He just wanted some of his problems to go away. But David, even though he was going to be king, even though he was going to make such a big impact on history, his family, did they ever regard him? I don't think so. I think they always just considered him just not worth it, like compared to everybody else. Oh, this guy's handsome, this guy's wonderful, this guy's charming, blah, blah, blah. But I really don't think they ever could see what others saw in him. God saw it. God looks at the heart. But it wasn't just God. Other people said, man, David is mighty. He's valiant. He's brave. He's courageous. He's a man of war. He's incredibly good at playing instruments and singing. They saw all these qualities, but his own family couldn't. And sometimes it gets really hard when people within your family cannot look at you any way except the way they do, because they don't want to. And you're like, what is it? Why does everybody else? Why is everyone else in the family so close? And yet I just can't be with them and loved and accepted by them. It doesn't always happen. It can just be that they choose not to see it that way. But David didn't let that get him ugly and bitter. He just kept taking care of what he could take care of, his character and what he did. It never says he retaliates or is nasty and ugly. He just keeps pursuing God and pressing into him. Isn't that something? Joseph's brothers in Genesis, they had lots of reasons not to like him. And he was shoved in their face and he was just snotty and arrogant. It never says anything like that about David. Yet, David is disregarded a lot more. And while he wasn't sold into slavery, sometimes the rejection can be just as bad, because you have to constantly be living with just not being considered worthy of someone's attention or time, or only thing you're good for is to do the job that nobody else wants to do. So what does he do? He doesn't retaliate. He just presses into God and draws closer to him. And look at what happens to his life compared to all his brothers. His brothers are never talked about, never made into anything. And then when David becomes king, he still has quite a bit of problems because he comes from a dysfunctional family and has a high ACEs score. But look at what he was able to become by constantly turning his heart and his mind back to Jesus and to what he needs to do to purify himself. That should give us all hope today.